excess linoleic acid in the human diet leads to excess linoleic acid in human cell membranes. And that creates an oxidative liability for us. It puts extra stress on the body. It's sort of like having extra dry wood around your cabin in the mountains and always running your wood burning stove. And is a spark going to fly out and cause a fire? There's some interesting studies that have been done about membrane turnover and the idea that when we have less polyunsaturated fats in our membranes, we tend to do better. We have to think about what we are eats. And if a chicken is eating grains and if a pig is eating grains, the fact of the matter is that the fat in those animals, whether it's chicken meat or eggs or pork fat, is enriched with linoleic acid at a level that you wouldn't find in a wild variant of those things. Fruit juice, and honey do not cause diabetes. They don't cause humans to become less metabolically healthy. In fact, the research would argue they allow us to become more metabolically healthy. And there's even a randomized controlled trials where honey was given to diabetics up to 125 grams a day, and it improved metrics of glucose tolerance and insulin sensitivity. Fish is dangerous today. It's just a scary thing to be eating. And I think most people are eating fish because they're afraid of red meat, and they need to know that red meat is back on the menu. And red meat is totally healthy for you and not bad for you in any way, shape, or form. It's healthier than chicken. It's healthier than pork. It's healthier than fish in so many ways. So eat more red meat. Don't fear it.
Paul, what would you say are the top foods you see people eating where they think they're eating something healthy, but they're actually destroying their health?
So I would say salad, greens in general, salad, oatmeal, grains. Those are the biggest ones. So that's when they think they're eating healthy, but they're probably doing bad things to their health. And we can talk about why.
All right, well, let's jump into each of these, starting with salad.
So salad is leaves, right? And this is individual. Not everyone is as sensitive as the next person with regard to sensitivities, but leaves are one of the most highly defended parts of plants. So when you think about a plant in the ground, and we've talked about this before, plants are rooted in the ground, they can't move. And over the last 400 plus million years of coevolution between animals and insects and plants have had to develop defense chemicals. These are not a fairy tale. They're not an imaginative thing. They're real. And these are things like oxalates, digestive enzyme inhibitors, other defense chemicals that can be sensitized to certain humans, like isothiocyanates can affect iodine absorption at the level of the thyroid. So when we are eating leaves, whether it's a spinach leaf or kale, those are probably the two biggest ones I think of, but we can also talk about lettuce. We imagine that we're doing something good. And this isn't to say that there are no vitamins or minerals in spinach or kale. The problem with these is that we have a high amount of potentially problematic other compounds that come along with these vitamins and minerals. And so I think that what I would say is that there are better ways to get vitamins and minerals without the extra problematic compounds that are in these foods. So let's talk about spinach specifically first. Spinach is very, very high in oxalates. The human body makes a small amount of these every day. Oxalates are essentially oxalic acid. It's a dicarboxylic acid. More and more people have heard about this now because it's starting to become something in the zeitgeist, but it's a big problem for a lot of humans. The main kidney stone that we suffer from as humans is a calcium oxalate kidney stone. And oxalic acid from plants is a major, major contributor to the oxalate in the kidney stones. Now, some people are more predisposed to hyperabsorbing oxalates. Some people don't break it down very well in their gut. But if you know anyone who's had a kidney stone, it's likely a calcium oxalate kidney stone. And they've likely been told by their doctor not to eat spinach or almonds or other foods that are pretty high in oxalates. So I think that most of us are okay with a little bit of oxalates in our diet, but many people run into either gut issues or joint issues. Some people even get pain. There's a whole syndrome of sort of vulvovaginal pain in women, cystitis, that could be linked to excess oxalates. And so I think that we generally need to take an honest look at our diets if we're experiencing any pain issues, any fatigue, any of these problems, and think how many oxalates are in our diet total. Sweet potatoes are moderate in oxalates. So it's pretty easy eating healthy foods. And I'm not saying sweet potatoes are unhealthy. They're not the major offender here. Spinach is the big one. Turmeric powder is also quite high. Navy beans. But you think you could make a, quote, very healthy dinner with sweet potato, almonds on the side, spinach, navy beans, and that would be a very large load of oxalates for a human. Now, your body can sort of get rid of them, but they do accumulate and it puts more stress on our body. So over time, it's just going to be very individual, person to person, what we're going to do in terms of how we're processing these oxalates. Kale is another one that I think is highly, highly overrated. Kale wasn't really a big deal until, before 2014, I believe. The biggest buyer of kale was Pizza Hut, who used it as garnish on their salad bars. Nobody really thought about kale 10 years ago. And then somehow kale got a lobby and kale has become an institution. And I think that we've gone wrong there because kale is a very robust leaf that grows all over the world in cold temperatures. But if you've ever tried to eat raw kale, it's quite bitter and it's very fibrous. And it's just not very palatable. At least spinach is soft, but we talked about the problems with spinach. The big issue with kale and a lot of the plants in that same family, the brassica family, the mustard family, is that they contain a set of compounds called isothiocyanates, which do, in research, clearly inhibit iodine absorption at the level of the thyroid. Now, if you're eating a lot of iodine in your diet, you might not notice this, but for people who have marginal levels of iodine or have pre-existing thyroid issues, this can definitely worsen things. And we see this across the globe in regions where people eat a lot of cassava, which is a root vegetable that is high in isothiocyanates. And that does create endemic goiter. They get these very swollen necks. You can search that term, endemic goiter, and see super swollen necks on people who have this imbalance between iodine coming into their diet from meat or other animal products, eggs, fish, dairy, milk contains a lot of iodine, and foods that we're eating that we think are healthy, like kale or cassava. There are many foods that have these isothiocyanates that are inhibiting our absorption of that. So if someone is listening to this and they have any thyroid issues, you might want to think about your consumption of isothiocyanates, these series of compounds of which sulforaphane is one, and all of the foods that have those in them. So those are the two big ones in terms of leaves. Lettuce is more benign, but if you really look at it, lettuce actually has more heavy metals than you would expect. So there's been a number of studies looking at the levels of heavy metals in plant foods in general, and we can talk about chocolate also, which has pretty high levels of heavy metals. And lettuce has a lot of heavy metals. So I think it's individual, right? The way that I've tried to frame this for people in most of the work that I've done recently is, look, if you're thriving, if you're crushing it in every area of your life, sleep, libido, body composition, mental clarity, muscle recovery, strength, don't change anything. You're already doing amazing. We want to study you, come to our laboratory and we'll study you. I don't actually have a laboratory, but if I did, right? Let's just study you. But if you're not thriving, I want people to know that there are, and this is a well-pointed question on your behalf, there are a lot of foods that we think of as healthy that could be harming us. And they generally, I think, end up coming from this realm of plants with defense chemicals. And every individual is uniquely sensitive. Some people can tolerate it, some people don't. And so it's interesting to see what happens for humans when you think about this. And a lot of people do significantly better when they cut these foods out of their diet temporarily to see if they feel better. So that's kind of the easy intervention is, if you have joint pain, if you have thyroid issues, if you have fatigue, if you have low libido, if you have depression, if you have problems with your sleep, and you're already eating a healthy diet, and it has spinach and kale and foods like chocolate or lettuce and things that could have lots of heavy metals, you could check your heavy metals, you could check your thyroid function, you could, check levels of oxalates in your urine if you want, or you can just cut those things out and see if you feel better temporarily and then add them back in gradually. So we got spinach, we got kale, we got turmeric with oxalates, we got almonds with oxalates, we got navy beans, we even got lettuce with heavy metals. Let's move on to the grains, because I did say oatmeal and other grains are a problem. So people think of oatmeal as this quintessential breakfast, but when I look at oatmeal, I see a train wreck. Oatmeal is a grain. All grains are seeds. If you take an oat, most of the oats we get are smashed. They're rolled oats, but oats are kind of circular and they're seeds. You can plant them in the ground and it'll grow an oat plant, which is the way plants work. You eat the seeds of plants, you are eating the most highly defended part of plants. Seeds are very vulnerable. They are the plant's intentional movement of their DNA to the next generation, so they must defend them. If a plant wants to protect its DNA, it has to put defense chemicals. So oats are very high in phytic acid, which is this big molecule that chelates other minerals. So oats will actually rob you of minerals that you are eating with the oats. The phytic acid doesn't really get absorbed in your body and steal minerals from your body, but anything you are eating with oats the absorption of the minerals in that food will be lessened because of this phytic acid in the oats. Some people have responded, the cooking process degrades phytic acid, which is true, but only about 40%. So you're left with 50 to 60% of phytic acid in your oats, even if you've cooked them. If you truly want to completely abolish any phytic acid in your oats, you have to ferment them, according to research studies, for 5 to 7 days at 85 to 90 degrees Fahrenheit with a pH of 4. So your overnight oats might decrease phytic acid more than 40 to 50%, but not much more. And you're still getting phytic acid even if you're doing overnight oats. Any fermentation of the oats will help break phytic acid down, but it won't completely abolish it. To completely remove phytic acid from oats, you have to do very intentional, very arduous things, and your oats will probably just end up being moldy on the counter at that point anyway. So they're just not a great food in terms of net mineral balance. And that's just the start with oats. I mean, oats also accumulate heavy metals. There's multiple studies on cadmium levels in oats. Oats are part of a family of plant seeds, like with quinoa, though they're in separate families, but they all contain these saponin compounds. They're soapy compounds that can irritate the gut that are not degraded when you cook them at all. So a lot of oats are also contaminated with glyphosate. If they're not organic oats, many oats are also contaminated with gluten. So you have heavy metals, you have phytic acid robbing you of minerals, you have saponins, which are a defense chemical in the oats and also quinoa. You have all sorts of problems with oats, and there are benefits to oats. They do have some minerals, which you will absorb very few because they're not very bioavailable because of the phytic acid, but they do provide complex carbohydrates, and certainly you could eat them before a run. And if you've given enough time to digest the oats, you might feel okay. But what's interesting is, again, going back to what we were talking about previously, if you're not thriving, maybe it's time to question some of these foods. Personally, I have a story about oats. Maybe people will claim this is why I have such a vendetta against them, but oats, I'm quite positive oats were a major driver in recurrent stress fractures that I had when I was younger. So when I was in college, I started running distance, and I was never very fast, so I had to run long distances. And I started running 5Ks and then 10Ks, and then I started running more and more. And inevitably, I would get a stress fracture. The first stress fracture I got was in college. So I was an 18 or 19-year-old young man, and I had a stress fracture in my femur. That's a large bone that connects your hip to your knee. Usually people don't get stress fractures in their femur. That bone is like a little baseball bat. And so the doctors and my parents were worried that I had a cancer, like a sarcoma or something, and I had a bone scan. It turned out to be just be a stress fracture, but my diet in college was pretty poor, a typical American college student's diet. I was eating pasta, so I was getting wheat, which also has phytic acid. I was doing that with maybe some cheese. So there's some calcium in there, but it's not being very absorbed. I was doing it with tuna from a can full of heavy metals, mixing in some spinach, putting it in the bag and shaking it up to make like a tuna casserole full of, all sorts of PFAs and forever chemicals. This is just the nightmare that was my diet when I was a kid. And then I would eat oatmeal probably 2 or 3 times a day because it was cheap and it was good. So I would take bananas and milk, pasteurized milk at that point in my life, actually, and have tons of oats. I remember I bought a 50-pound bag of oats one time, and I thought, this is great. It's probably feed for horses. I don't know what human buys a 50-pound bag of oats, but it's affordable and it tastes good. I used to do a lot of aerobic exercise, whether it was running and then mountain biking, and I ate tons of oats. And fast forward, I had a stress fracture in my fibula, one in my tibia, and then one in my foot. So I've had 3 to 4 stress fractures in my life, completely resolved when I cut grains out of my diet. I mean, I had so many different experiments over the last 25 years in my diet, and cutting out grains, that single intervention, as I went into a paleo diet, which doesn't have any grains, that just never had a stress fracture or any issues with bone density. I recently put a video on my YouTube channel, getting a DEXA scan, looking at my liver fat and bone density, normal bone density now. And once I cut the grains out, once I cut the oatmeal out, all of these phytic acid containing foods, I was able to increase my running distance by far. I was able to run 80, 90 miles a week, which is something I'd never been able to do previously with really no issues with bone density or stress fractures. So again, back to the framework, if you're thriving, don't change anything. But if you have recurrent stress fractures, low bone density, kidney stones, fatigue, almost anything, it's important to think about these defense chemicals across the foods. So broadly, we've talked about leaves and grains. We talked about oats, but I think the other grains are problematic for a lot of people too. We talked about quinoa, very hard for humans to digest unless you're pressure cooking it or fermenting it for days and days. And we could go down the list of other grains. But I think those are right off the top. Those are some big ones for people to think about that are held in high regard, that are, I would argue, net negative for many people. Maybe not everyone, but a lot of people.
All right, you went deep there. That was great. But we've only picked on plants so far. Let's take this to the animal world and talk about foods there that people consider healthy, but we need to maybe take a closer look.
Some people have sensitivities to eggs. And recently, something came out about eggs. Vital Farms got called out for feeding their chickens marigold flowers to make the eggs more orange. It is true that if you have a chicken that is grazing, rooting and pecking in the wild, quote unquote, and they're getting bugs and worms and maybe sometimes they'll eat little mice or voles, that egg is going to be very orange because they're eating what they're supposed to eat. But you can circumvent the process. You can shortcut it by feeding them marigold flowers, and it makes it look really orange, but it's not really a reflection of a much higher nutrition content in that egg yolk. Most of us can understand that if you're eating chickens raised by a chicken mega farm and they're just eating grains and they're in cages all day, that's probably not super healthy. And there have also been some studies looking at chicken feed. And we know that what a chicken eats determines the amount of linoleic acid in the egg yolk. historically, chickens didn't eat a lot of grains, and they had much lower levels of linoleic acid in the egg yolk. Now, for people that aren't familiar, linoleic acid is an 18-carbon omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acid. It occurs naturally in our foods, but I think that evolutionarily inappropriate consumption of high amounts of that are a driver of issues for humans. That's sort of foreshadowing a conversation about seed oils, which are simply the biggest source of linoleic acid that we get in our diets, and linoleic acid that's also been through some pretty heavy refining. Eggs contain linoleic acid. It's not toxic, but I think that for a lot of us, we're getting too much of it because we might be eating eggs that are fed grains, which increases the amount of linoleic acid. If you're eating bacon, those pigs are also fed grains. Now, pigs aren't supposed to eat grains. They're not supposed to eat corn and soy, and that sort of artificially elevates the amount of linoleic acid in pig fat. So if you have bacon and eggs for breakfast, you could be getting a lot of linoleic acid in your diet. And again, this isn't refined, bleached, and deodorized seed oils, which I think are much worse. And in general, I think animal foods are very healthy for humans, but quality matters. And so if we're really being honest, we have to think about what we are eating eats. And if a chicken is eating grains and if a pig is eating grains, the fact of the matter is that the fat in those animals, whether it's chicken meat or eggs or pork fat, is enriched with linoleic acid at a level that you wouldn't find in a wild variant of those things. Now, why is this a problem? I think that excess linoleic acid in the human diet leads to excess linoleic acid in human cell membranes. And that creates an oxidative liability for us. It puts extra stress on the body. It's sort of like having extra dry wood around your cabin in the mountains and always running your wood-burning stove. And is a spark going to fly out and cause a fire? Yeah, it's just a problem for us in our membranes. And there's some interesting studies that have been done about membrane sort of turnover and the idea that when we have less polyunsaturated fats in our membranes, we tend to do better. So that's a whole rabbit hole we could go down. But this polyunsaturated ratio to saturated fat ratio in cell membranes is highly influenced by the amount of polyunsaturated fats we eat. Humans have interesting biochemistry. We can make saturated fats and interconvert them with monounsaturated fats, but we can't interconvert polyunsaturated fats with mono or anything else. We can't saturate fats in the same way that we can between a mono and a saturated fat. So a monounsaturated fat has one double bond, but a polyunsaturated fat has multiple double bonds, and we can't turn a polyunsaturated fat into a monounsaturated fat. And that's a problem. Ruminants can do that. So cows, interestingly, a cow doesn't have the same change in their fatty acid composition when they're fed grains. This isn't an argument to eat grain-fed cattle. I'm much more a fan of grass-fed cattle for a variety of reasons, but ruminants don't do that. But any monogastric animal, be it humans, be it chickens, be it pigs, those are the main, chickens and pigs are the main things we eat that are monogastric. We accumulate polyunsaturated fats. So that's something to think about. The quality of your eggs matters. And unfortunately, today, I don't want this to sound impossible for people listening to the podcast. It's very difficult to find good eggs unless you make your own, because the majority of eggs, even if they are pasture raised and organic, are fed corn and soy. This came out with Vital Farms, right? So we have evolutionarily inappropriate amounts of linoleic acid in the diets of pigs and chickens, creating chicken fat, eggs, and pork, which might not be as good for us or what our bodies are expecting based on what we've experienced evolutionarily. The other thing I'll say about eggs is for some people, the albumin in egg yolks can cause autoimmune reactions. It's just an immune thing that happens. And so if you have autoimmune conditions, maybe cutting eggs for a short amount of time is a good idea. The other thing we could think about is pasteurized milk. And I will draw a clear distinction between pasteurized milk and raw milk. Raw milk has not been heated. And there's been a lot of talk about raw milk recently with the whole bird flu thing. And we can get into that if you want. But if you look at the research, raw milk clearly affects the immune system, I would say, in a positive way. And pasteurized milk is either net zero or negative. And I think a lot of people listening to this podcast have had negative experiences with, quote, milk that they drank growing up. I did, other people I know. And so I think that the evidence points to the notion that when you pasteurize milk, when you heat milk, there's a conformational change in the whey protein, and that can maybe be immunogenic for some people, cause issues with the immune system. So I'm not a huge fan of pasteurized milk. The other thing we have to talk about now is bovaer. Have you heard of this?
No, actually I haven't.
It's Bovaer. And bovaer is an additive. You can fact check me on this. It may be connected with Bill Gates. So fact check that, please. But that's at least what's come up in some colloquial conversations I've had with friends recently. It's an additive given to cows, mostly dairy cows. A lot of them are in Australia, but they're in other places in the world too, that's decreasing methane emissions. And we don't really know what this additive is going to do to humans. It's not really safe and it hasn't fully been tested. So now you have to think more about your dairy and potentially meat from a cow that's fed bovaer, Bovaer. And I think the whole thing is a little bit ludicrous because it's based on the premise that methane from cows is a significant contributor to any sort of climate on this earth that we live. And I think that's crazy and unsubstantiated. If we believe that carbon dioxide is a major driver of climate change, which people debate heavily on both sides. But if we accept that, we know that methane in the atmosphere does become carbon dioxide eventually. Cows do produce methane, but so do humans when we fart or burp. And that methane that animals produce is part of a carbon cycle. And it's a very, very small contribution to overall methane or carbon dioxide equivalents in our atmosphere relative to energy production, your cross-country plane flight, driving a car, using your home. I mean, these are massive. I'm talking, if you look at the United States based on EPA data, agriculture in animals, I believe, is around 2.6% of total CO2 equivalents. 2.6% animal agriculture. Plant agriculture is 2.6 or 2.7. So just the amount of carbon dioxide equivalents produced by eating plants because of the use of tilling and all of the machines on the farm that produce exhaust and the use of trucks to move the plants across the country produces the same amount of carbon dioxide equivalents as animal foods. But no one is calling for a kale hiatus, right? No one's calling for major tariffs on kale because of the huge amount of carbon dioxide impact related to kale. It's clearly, I would say, politically motivated here, or driven by companies looking to make profit on ultra-processed plant foods or ultra-processed animal foods. But ultra-processed food in general is much more profitable than unprocessed food. And then if you break down the 2.6% of animal agriculture, only about 1.8% of that is cattle. So we're looking at a 1.8%. And if you look at the relative contributions of energy, electricity generation, transportation, those are in the 25 to 30% margin. So we have more than 10x in other sectors of our sort of overall economy. And no one is really focusing on that, right? We're just being told, look at the cows. And now we're feeding cows a chemical that we don't fully understand the long-term health effects in humans to ostensibly decrease methane emissions, which are part of a carbon cycle and have always been there and are probably not a significant contributor to any sort of climate change in the first place. It's ludicrous. So that's my overall take on animal foods in terms of possible issues.
Okay, let's stick on this cow piece and this chemical, because this is new to me. Is this something that will be found in conventional beef and organic and grass-fed, grass-finished? Or just conventional?
Only conventional. They can't feed it to a cow that's organic. And my sense is it's mostly dairy cows. So it's going to end up in pasteurized milk. It's going to end up in butter. But I do think it's actually being fed to some cows that will be used for meat. But it can't be an organic meat. And it can't be in something that's called grass-fed, grass-finished, I don't think. Although we'd have to look at the regulations and it's probably country by country. So it gets back to sort of know your farm, know the quality of what you're eating.
All right. While we're talking about new chemicals and cows, in preparing for this interview, I heard you talk about this new thing that they're giving to cows where they can eat less calories and put on body fat. So another way where humans are going in, interjecting and creating this frankenfood.
Not a new thing, unfortunately. It's been around for, I would say, decades. It's well known in mainstream ranching circles. And I've talked to Dave Asprey and I talked to Dale Brisby about this. One of the compounds they can give to cows is called zearalenone. It's a mold toxin, and they put this little pellet in the cow's ear, and it basically causes metabolic dysfunction. And so you feed the cow less and they get fatter in some sort of sinister mirroring of what's happening to humans. It's interesting that there are compounds in our environments, this compound directly given to cattle, that can break our metabolism. So you can eat an equivalent amount of calories and gain more weight. Right? That's a really interesting paradigm. That's a really interesting model system to look at what's happening to humans. Humans aren't being fed this chemical that we know of. Maybe parts of it are getting into our food supply, or potentially it's contaminating meat when they give the cows this chemical in their ear and it goes in their whole body, or dairy. But yeah, I mean, the savings are pretty massive for these farmers and these ranchers. They can give, I was talking to Dale Brisby, who's a rancher and has done this. And he said, it's like a 20 to 30% reduction in feed cost for these farmers, which is incredible when you're thinking about the slim profit margin of a rancher. There aren't many cattle ranchers who drive Lamborghinis. I don't think I know any. This isn't a lucrative business. This is a hard business done to create, I would say, some of the most nutrient dense food for humans. It's not always done in the best way, unfortunately, but this is an interesting thing that you can give a cow a metabolic toxin and feed them 20% less food, and they gain the same amount of weight. That's crazy. And that's probably exactly what's happening to humans. Again, maybe not the same chemical, but I think there are many of these metabolic toxins in our environment that are making it harder for us to lose weight and making the calorie idea kind of go out the window. Because if not all calories are created equally, and the hypothesis that arises from this becomes, wait, if I eat 200 calories of Doritos, am I going to store more of that as fat than 200 calories of steak? And I would say there's a real possibility you are. So if you are struggling with weight loss, the quality of your food is just as important, if not more important, than the number of calories you eat.
So to me, there's two different layers to this last point we brought up, where they're feeding this chemical to cows. Actually, not feeding them. You mentioned it goes in the ear.
I think it goes in the ear, yeah, a lot of times. Or they inject it or something, yeah.
So we have to look at, does that make it, you mentioned this quickly, into the meat, and then we consume it, and then does that break our metabolism? And then number two, even if it doesn't, we're still having chemical changes, I'm sure, in that meat that we're consuming. And how is that interacting with our biology? Because we're tempering with the meat before it's, butchered and then consumed.
We don't fully know, right? It's never really been studied. The FDA, the USDA turns a blind eye here and doesn't really call for the appropriate amount of studies to be done. So it's an economics thing in terms of ranching, because it's hard to convince people to pay more for their meat. I think that we don't always understand what goes into making a steak, and that's a tricky thing. Yeah. It's creating a metabolically unwell cow. So even if only trace amounts of that chemical are found in the meat, are there other problems with the meat because of the metabolic dysfunction that this chemical is causing?
Exactly. So are we assuming that cows that are organic or grass-fed, grass-finished, again, won't have this latter issue?
They should not. They should not.
And this is why this part of the conversation is just as important as the plants that we were beating up early on, because even in the meat realm, you can think you're doing great for your health and you're eating healthy, but there is so much nuance even to this health food.
We are literally being bombarded with toxins, and that sounds like hyperbole, but I don't believe it is. They're everywhere now. It's crazy in our food supply, in plant foods and in animal foods, like we talked about, in dairy, in meat, in leaves, it's all over the place. And then it's also in our living environments too. So in our clothes, it's difficult. And again, I don't mean this to be a message of despondency for anyone listening. I think it's a message of education and a message of know better, do better. If you understand, you can navigate the environment. We simply have come to a place in 2024 where our world has gotten quite complicated. And I know that more and more people are suffering. Obesity rates are rising, infertility rates are rising. It's all going in the wrong direction. And many, many people are suffering with chronic health illnesses, everything from autoimmune conditions, thyroid conditions, skin issues, depression, anxiety. I mentioned infertility, low libido. We're a very, very sick culture. And I think based on my experience in Western medicine, being a doctor, Western medicine doesn't have answers to this. And Western medicine isn't really asking the right questions. And so we're left to our own devices as consumers to educate ourselves. And the response should not be, I hope the response for people is not, oh my God, this is impossible, but let me learn as much as I can and go step by step and do what I can today and do a little more tomorrow and eventually get to the place where my life is significantly healthier weeks to months later. And you have to know about these inputs to make those intentional decisions.
I want to come back to the part of the conversation where you talked about different animals and linoleic acid. This is really important, and this is a part of the conversation that's really pertinent to me because it's part of where I'm at right now on my health journey, where up until this point, I've looked for the organic label, grass-fed, grass-finished. But when it comes to chicken, you're adding this whole other layer in pork where it's not good enough to go to Costco now and get organic chicken, buy organic pork at Whole Foods, organic bacon. These animals, being monogastric, need to have the right foods to have the right fat composition for our bodies. And the other detail there that you added, which is great, is the fact that for people who are, say, on a budget or don't have access, it's different with cows due to their digestion. So you can get away with, not that we're recommending it, but you can get away with less quality and more conventional beef, and the quality of that end product will be better than if we're talking about chickens and pork. So the part I want to dive a bit deeper into is linoleic acid. You brought that up in relation to that. Do we know percentages of what linoleic acid would be in chicken and fish? Sorry, not fish. We're going to get to fish. Chicken and pork when fed their correct diet versus grains.
Yeah, we do. So historically, if you look at traditionally raised pigs, wild pigs, chickens, things like this, 3 to 4%, maybe 4.5% of the fat is linoleic acid. And then you look at a conventionally raised hog, pig, chicken, you get 20+%. So 4 to 5x. So it's pretty significant. And the same thing has happened to humans, which is interesting, Jesse. So you look at the composition of human fat in the last 70 years, and it's gone up significantly. So our fat has also become more full of linoleic acid. And there's a great study by Stephen Guyonnet that looks at that specifically. Like, we are becoming more full of polyunsaturated fats in our fat when we do fat biopsies. And animals are also becoming more full of polyunsaturated fats, specifically this 18 carbon omega-6 linoleic acid. And this isn't to say that people should never eat bacon, never eat eggs, or never eat chicken, just that it worries me when red meat specifically is vilified. And people are discouraged from eating red meat, whether it's because of a climate impact, which we briefly touched upon how misleading that might be. I don't really think that the climate impact from any sort of meat is any like legitimate argument to not eat it. People are also dissuaded from eating red meat because of health impacts, which I would argue are completely fabricated. Red meat is one of the healthiest foods for humans. Even if it's grain-fed, it's still healthy for humans and full of so many nutrients. And yet we're being told not to eat red meat. And what are our other options? And we've talked about chicken and pork a little bit, and we can talk about the fish. I would argue that red meat, whether it's beef or lamb or elk, or what do people eat? Bison. These are some of the healthiest foods on the planet, full stop. And to shun those in favor of a grain-fed pork, grain-fed chicken, or farm-raised fish, even a lot of wild fish is heavily contaminated today. I think that's a wrong move. I think that's the bad move. And yeah, I think that we should not fear red meat, and I think we should eat more of it, not less of it.
Well, what this is all coming to early on in the conversation here is the fact that the answer seems to be in simplicity and eating less diversity, because we're talking about all these different plant toxins, different toxins in different animals, and it gets really complex really quickly. And for people, at least early on, if they're just learning about all this, the solution is to narrow your diet down and eat more simply. And throughout this conversation, we've already talked about the ruminant animals, but we're going to give you the template. And then over time, if you want to get fancy, you can learn about different plant toxins. And like you talked about before, fermenting, cooking, different things we can do to remove some of those. But in the beginning, the only answer I can really give to people is keep it simple while you're learning. And then you're going to be getting the nutrition you need and minimizing all these toxins.
I love that perspective. I think there's so much power in simplicity in our diets, and we can foreshadow this or give people a little bit of a blueprint now. I don't think everyone needs to eat an animal-based diet, but that's just a way of eating that I've sort of found to be helpful for me and a lot of people. And that is just a term that I think happened when I was on Joe Rogan's podcast. And I think of it basically, an animal-based diet is a little bit like carnivore 2.0. We all learn and evolve. And I've changed my perspective since I was a carnivore dieter. I've been eating animal-based for about 4 years. Animal-based is basically meat and fruit. That's the simplest way to say it. And we talked a little bit about leaves and seeds earlier, and a little bit about roots with cassava. But when you look at the dichotomy or the distinction between the vegetable parts of plants, which are the leaves, stems, roots, and seeds, versus the fruit, there's a big difference in terms of defense chemicals. Not all fruit is completely free of defense chemicals, and we know that when a fruit ripens, the defense chemicals in the fruit decrease. So if plants also don't want you eating unripe fruit, you can see defense chemicals in unripe fruit that lessen as the fruit ripens, interestingly. Fruit is a plant's colorful, sweet intention to us to move their seeds somewhere else. And so fruit has a lot less of these problems in it. Some fruit has oxalates. Raspberries, blackberries are not free of oxalates. They're moderate, actually, because they have so many seeds in them. Even things like kiwi can have a moderate amount of oxalates. The data is out on dates. There's sort of conflicting data on whether dates have a significant amount of oxalates. But in general, fruit, I would say, has much, much lower levels of defense chemicals. There's no significant impact from phytic acid in fruit. There are no major isothiocyanates or iodine inhibitors in fruit. These things like saponins, these digestive enzyme, like problematic compounds for digestive enzymes, these gut irritating compounds like saponins don't occur in ripe fruit. So now, the other thing I'll say with regard to fruit is there are many foods we think of as vegetables that are actually fruit, things like avocado or squash. So when you're thinking fruit, you're thinking blueberries, strawberries, banana, apples, whatever seasonal where you are, but also pumpkins, spaghetti squash, kabocha squash, zucchini, cucumber, avocado. These are all fruit. Anything that has seeds in it is a fruit. So I think there is a very sustainable, simple, easy diet for most people that is meat and fruit for some amount of time to see how this affects your overall symptoms, whether those symptoms be all of the ones we listed earlier, and then gradual introduction of the foods that you're missing most that might be vegetables. And I love that you foreshadowed this. We can talk a little bit about the fact that humans are resourceful and there are ways to partially or mostly detoxify the vegetable foods, which are traditional in nature. You look at the way that hunter-gatherer humans and indigenous populations of humans that eat some of these, quote, vegetable foods, they don't do it the way we do it. They don't just boil beans, right? They ferment beans for days. They don't just boil quinoa. Like I said earlier, they ferment quinoa. They do these processes. They make things like kimchi or sauerkraut. They ferment the cabbage. Well, guess what? Fermentation degrades isothiocyanates in cabbage. Cabbage is a brassica. It's part of that mustard family with kale. So if you really wanted to eat kale, you could ferment some kale in a sauerkraut with your cabbage, and that would have much, much lower amounts of these things. But to just eat those foods without attention to the potential negative impacts causes issues for a lot of people. Not everyone, but a lot of people.
One of the things that comes up for me when you bring up fruit is the domestication and changes in fruit from, say, what it would be 1,000 years ago to what we have access to today. And you would be the one to know better on this. Obviously, living in Costa Rica, I would assume you have access to fruit that's more in its natural form compared to what we can get over here in Canada and the US. But talk about how you think about that perspective, where fruits in a general sense have gotten bigger, higher sugar content. They're not the fruits that our ancestors would have eaten.
So this is an interesting thing for me. There are many fruits that we still can encounter today, generally in tropical areas, that are essentially unchanged from the way they were historically. There's all sorts of mangoes here in Costa Rica, jackfruit, very, very sweet things that have not really been hybridized or changed. So the notion that fruit was never large or sweet or full of sugar is just incorrect. It is true that some fruits like apples or pears, but also almonds, bananas have been hybridized and grafted and sort of intentionally raised to be bigger and sweeter. And when we look at the research, I don't think that's a problem for humans at all. I've still never seen a study, and if anyone in your audience hasn't access to the study, I would gladly read it and share it. I've never seen a study where humans were given in a controlled setting an apple, even the way it looks today, or a banana, or blueberries of today, and we see major negative effects. And in fact, we consistently see the opposite. And again, I'll just say that this is a place where I've learned a lot since my carnivore days. And I mean, I've gone deep down the rabbit hole regarding fruit juice, because there's a lot of people today that vilify fruit juice and they say, no, without the fiber, fruit isn't healthy for you. Well, there's about 25 randomized controlled trials that would directly argue with that position that none of these folks ever cite. I mean, whether you're talking about orange juice, blood orange juice, pineapple juice, apple juice, or blueberry juice, cherry juice, grape juice, watermelon juice, these have all been studied in humans. And invariably, they seem to have positive effects. There's even a study where people were given watermelon juice in the setting of an oral glucose tolerance test. So an OGTT is where people are given a liquid that looks like cola, it's gross, of pure glucose. Generally, this is done in pregnancy, but sometimes it's done in research settings. So they're handing you a glass, and it looks like soda, of pure glucose. And I think we could check this. I think it's 90 grams. It's a significant amount of pure glucose. And they look to see how your body responds to pure glucose, something that doesn't occur in nature. Pure fructose doesn't occur in nature either. And when they gave watermelon juice with an oral glucose tolerance test, people's insulin sensitivity was better. So they gave people more sugar in the form of watermelon juice, and they did better on an OGTT. Cherry juice, orange juice, blood orange juice, these have all been studied. Decreased lipid peroxidation, decreased DNA damage, decreased oxidative stress at the cell level. People know about pomegranate juice, a lot of the same outcomes. So I would challenge people listening to this to find a study in humans where fruit juice is given and we see negative effects. And these are not ancestral versions, right? This is a normal, today's 2024 or whenever the study was done, 2016 pomegranate. It's normal watermelon of today, right? It's a normal apple of today making the apple juice. It's a normal grape of today making grape juice. And so, yes, it's true some of these foods have been changed. And I think that doesn't translate into negative effects in humans that I've ever seen in the medical literature or myself. And yes, being at the equator, there are lots of fruit here that has never really been hybridized. And in its, quote, original state is super sweet and plentiful. The best example of this might be honey, which is an interesting analogy because honey is honey. We haven't made honey sweeter. Bees always make honey to be full of sugar, and it's full of glucose and fructose together. But if you look in humans, there's multiple studies that show health benefits to humans. And yes, it raises your blood sugar, but that actually doesn't look to be bad for us. And we can talk about that what I believe is a conflation there. I don't think raising your blood sugar after a meal that contains honey, preferably raw and organic, or fruit juice is bad for humans in any way, shape, or form. If you have diabetes, you're going to be more sensitive to that. And your metabolic machinery is a little broken and you don't process sugar very well. And yeah, your blood sugar could go up very dangerously high. And we can talk about how to mitigate that. But it's important that I state this very clearly, and I'll draw the line in the sand. Fruit juice, and honey do not cause diabetes. They don't cause humans to become less metabolically healthy. In fact, the research would argue they allow us to become more metabolically healthy. And there's even a randomized controlled trials where honey was given to diabetics up to 125 grams a day, and it improved metrics of glucose tolerance and insulin sensitivity. It raised their blood sugar a little bit. Their hemoglobin A1C went up slightly. I think the average increase in overall blood sugar in a 90-day period was 7 to 10 milligrams per deciliter versus a no honey group, but their tolerance of glucose got better. So yes, if you eat sugar, yes, if you eat fruit, yes, if you eat sugar in the form of honey, I should say, if you eat fruit juice and you're diabetic, your blood sugar will go up. That doesn't mean your diabetes is getting worse. It may mean that it's not the most prudent thing to do without being aware of the amount of sugar and honey and fruit that you're eating as a diabetic. And those probably aren't your first foods to go to, but those foods did not make you diabetic. That's really, really important to say. And I would love to debate anyone who feels differently, because glucose goddess, come at me. Like, I'm waiting for her. She won't have the conversation.
Well, when she was on my show talking about honey, she actually said that honey is worse for you than white sugar. Crazy. Because the fructose content is higher in honey versus white sugar.
We message on Instagram, Glucose Goddess, and I have asked her to come on the podcast and have friendly, respectful debate multiple times, and she never does it. So she's wrong in my strong opinion here. She's making this up. There's no studies that show that honey is worse for you than white sugar. Some honey does have more fructose than glucose, and no big deal. And I'll tell you why. So fructose is getting a really bad rap right now, and I think incorrectly. If someone is saying that fructose is bad for you, they are invariably, and I'll be fairly strong in these words because this is frustrating for me. They are invariably citing animal studies in mice and rats who have completely different biochemistry than with regard to humans in terms of de novo lipogenesis. Humans convert a very, very small amount of fructose in our diets to fat, which is de novo lipogenesis, like less than 1% or around 1%. Mice and rats do far, far more than that. So you're talking about, less than 1% is nothing. We convert most of the fructose in our diet to glucose, to glycogen, to glycerol. Glucose, glycogen, and lactate are the big sort of downstream metabolites of fructose. Like, we don't convert this to fat, anything like a mouse or a rat. The other studies that are done on fructose feed pure fructose, and that never occurs in nature. When you have fructose in the gut without glucose, you get malabsorption. And when you get fructose malabsorption, you get overgrowth of pathogenic bacteria and increases in lipopolysaccharide, which is also known as endotoxin. So that's really important, because when you give animals a compound that blocks the downstream effects of endotoxin, fructose doesn't look harmful anymore. Because when you're feeding fructose to an animal, they're also getting overgrowth of bacteria and converting more of it to fat with different biochemistry than us. But you can do this in humans too. You can give something that blocks TLR4 receptors, toll-like receptor 4, toll-like receptor 4, and that's the downstream sort of target of endotoxin. And so what's going on with fructose is overgrowth of the wrong type of bacteria in the gut from isolated fructose feeding. You don't malabsorb fructose when you consume it with glucose. It's a co-transporter. It's a symporter in the gut. So we don't get overgrowth. And fruit and honey contain compounds that also minimize or completely inhibit the absorption. Fruit and honey contain compounds that inhibit the overgrowth of bacteria in our gut. So polyphenols actually mitigate any of this bacterial overgrowth. You don't get endotoxin being released or endotoxin increasing in humans when you eat fruit, when you eat honey, when you eat fruit juice. But if you feed pure fructose, you do, because it's malabsorption. So this is frustrating for me. It's kind of mirroring a lot of things in nutrition. You can't take a reductionist lens and say fructose is bad because when we give you fructose, you don't do well. Well, that doesn't occur in nature. And it's impossible in nature to get glucose or fructose without polyphenols, without other compounds in honey. Honey has 300 plus compounds that we haven't even characterized. Some of which may be polyphenolic, some of them are not polyphenolic, but there's a lot going on here. It's much more complicated than a lot of people in the health spaces are making it out to be. And that's frustrating for me, because my concern here is that the consumer is just sort of throwing their hands up and is saying, Paul tells me vegetables are bad. Glucose Goddess tells me fruit is bad. Fruit juice is bad and honey is bad. This guy over here tells me meat is bad. Paul is now telling me chicken and pork are bad and fish is bad. There's nothing to eat. Therefore, all of these people are full of it. And look, I get that perspective, but I want people to understand that there's more nuance there, and perhaps explain my reasoning for feeling this way better than other people, or substantiate it with actual research, because I've never seen Glucose Goddess, whose name is Jessie, actually show any research to back this claim. And if you look on her website, there's certainly nothing there.
Well, another layer onto this too, you talked about everybody having different opinions that are conflicting and the consumer being so confused, and I agree with that, is that even the influencers, including yourself, are changing their mind at times. So in all fairness, it's not just that different influencers have different opinions. Different opinions are changing, which in my mind, that's a credible thing. You should continue to learn and continue to evolve, but it does add to the confusion and frustration for the end users.
I agree with you. I think it is a sign of critical thinking when people change their mind on things. And I've certainly changed my mind and evolved my perspective on a few things, fructose being one of them, as I learned more. And so I think as a health consumer, it would be better to follow or listening to people who are evolving. Everyone listening to this knows that they've changed their mind and evolved their perspective on things in the past. So I think it's okay. And I respect that that's difficult for people, because it is hard when you follow someone or a series of ideas and those ideas shift. But I think that's a good thing in general, and not to be, I don't know. I don't think it's a bad thing long-term. I think it's a good thing. And in my experience, there are some folks in the health space that have never changed their ideas ever, and others who have. And I like consuming content more from people who have changed their perspective.
Paul, our last chat was summer of 2023. So it's been a year and a bit. Speaking of changing your mind, any major pivots in that period of time with the way you eat or your healthy lifestyle?
I've added more fiber to my diet, not out of a real necessity, just out of variety and interest in that. I started eating more squash and I've enjoyed that. So yeah, I eat squash with most of my meals now. I think that's been a positive change. It means that I poop more, but I didn't necessarily feel bad without the fiber. I just wanted more variety in my carbohydrate sources beyond fruit and honey and raw milk. So that is an interesting thing. What else? So I've added creatine since then, which I think is a very important addition in terms of supplements. I think a lot of supplements are more difficult to make an argument for net benefit in humans. And I think creatine is pretty clearly beneficial for humans. So I do 5 grams of a pure sort of tested creatine with a little bit of sea salt added to it for increased absorption. Creatine has a lot of data regarding muscle performance, explosivity, mental performance in the setting of sleep deprivation. It's also been studied in pregnant mothers and high-risk pregnancies with positive effects. I don't see any downside. Creatine is an interesting thing because it's only occurring naturally in animal foods. And most people seem to benefit from around 5 grams a day. We make a little bit in our bodies, but not that much. So to get 5 grams a day, you need to eat over 2 pounds of meat, which is something I used to do as a strict carnivore, but I no longer do as an animal-based eater because I'm eating more carbohydrates. I get around 1.25 pounds of meat per day. There's not a lot of creatine in milk. And there's some disagreement in the space about if you're eating rare red meat, if it may have more creatine. I think some sources would suggest that 1 pound would have enough creatine, but I'd rather hedge my bets and have a little more creatine in my diet. So in the morning I get up and the first thing I do in the morning before I surf is I have raw milk from a local goat milk farm that I know and trust with some creatine. I'll put in some desiccated organs there with a little bit of desiccated testicle and desiccated liver from Heart and Soil, the company that I built. I'll put in raw honey because I actually don't fear spiking my blood sugar at all in the morning. I don't even like the word spike. It sounds so negative. It'll just raise my blood sugar, which is, I think, an important thing in the morning to blunt the cortisol awakening response that we get as we're waking up. And then I will add in a little bit of B vitamins, which we can talk to also. So a methylated B vitamin, thinking more about my genetics, folate genetics specifically. But I think creatine is kind of a no-brainer for a lot of people. And even women, people that are not weight training, can benefit from creatine, especially on the mental performance aspect. The other thing that I've added is these methylated B vitamins. So I've known for a while that I have polymorphisms at the level of MTHFR. And when I don't do these, my homocysteine is around 11 or 12. And when I take a methylated B complex with both folinic acid and L-methylfolate, along with riboflavin, B6, B12 in the form of adenosylcobalamin and methylcobalamin, and about 700 milligrams of TMG, which is trimethylglycine, my homocysteine goes down to 7.5. And I think that's a better physiologic level for homocysteine. I notice differences in the way that I feel with that as well. Not everyone needs to do a methylated B vitamin, but I think a lot of us could probably benefit from that, especially if we have any problems with folate genetics, specifically at MTHFR, which has 2 loci, 1298 and 677. So that's a little bit more of a rabbit hole we can go down. And then at night, and I'll give a shout out to my buddy, Gary Brecka, who mentioned this to me. I hadn't thought about doing this, but at night I take 1 milligram of methylfolate and it helps me with rumination. So I think all of us are sort of dealt a different hand when it comes to our genetics and the way our brains work and how quickly we metabolize catecholamines and how quickly we're able to turn our brains on and off. One of the things I've struggled with my whole life is turning my brain off. And I think at the end of a day, working, podcasting, doing things like this, I have a lot of catecholamines, that being epinephrine, norepinephrine, dopamine in my brain. And that sometimes makes it hard to go to sleep. So taking a little bit of methylfolate has helped me with rumination at night and then easier to go back to sleep when I wake up in the middle of the night. So those are interesting supplement additions that I've done recently. Dietary stuff is probably pretty similar to where I was a year and a half ago. I still eat about 1 pound, 1.25 pounds, maybe 1.5 pounds of meat per day with organs, either fresh or desiccated. I still do raw milk. I still do honey. I still scale my carbohydrates based on my activity level. I have more activity in Costa Rica, so I eat more carbohydrates because I surf every day here. I still try to get out in the sun. I still try to ground. I still think about RF, EMF in my house. That's sort of Wi-Fi band EMF. I also think about ELF, which is more of the outlets and the electricity in the house. I still think about the clothes I wear. I'm just going through my mental list of all the things I do in my life to see if anything else has changed. I still think about the clothes I wear and the quality of the fabrics, and I still try to really protect my circadian rhythm. So a lot of that's pretty similar, and we can drill down on any of those patterns. I will say that I still get most of my calories from fruit, raw milk, and honey, and I probably get maybe 25% of the carbohydrates now from squash.
One thing I noticed in a couple of your later videos, and this ties into all the new hacks that you're doing, is in your fridge, you put a piece of red plastic over the light to help with the blue light there at night. Talk more about that, and then other things you're doing in the light realm to optimize that.
Yeah, I think a lot about light these days, and I'm sitting in my little home studio right now, and I have a blue light over here that's not on, and there's another one over there that's not on, and we're just using natural light coming through the window because I don't like sitting in front of the blue lights if I don't have to. If I go on someone else's podcast, I will sit in front of their like sort of studio lighting, but if I'm at home, I prefer not to. I've just found that my sleep is better, and generally this is sleep, when I avoid blue light, especially in the latter half of the day. We started recording at noon, my time locally, and I avoid light that's flickering too much. So those are two different things. Blue is obviously has to do with the sort of the distribution of wavelengths in light. And especially at night, it generally gets dark by around 6 o'clock here in Costa Rica year round because we're by the equator. So it never gets dark terribly earlier or later than that. So after it's dark, I will use only red lights in my house, and I'll really try to look at my computer less and less as I get close to when I go to sleep. I go to sleep pretty early, 8 or 8:30, because I get up early to surf in the morning. And I will try to be off my phone for at least an hour or two before I go to sleep. If you look at your computer versus your phone, they flicker at different rates. And flickering is this on-off oscillation of a light. So even though I can't see it, this screen that I'm looking at right now is flickering. My computer's flickering. My phone is flickering. The flicker on my phone, I think, based on my subjective experience, is particularly dysregulating for my circadian rhythm. Even if I have a blue light filter on my phone and it's fully red, and I've talked about how to make your phone that way in the past week, it's just a hack. You can do it in your settings. But even though it's fully red, I think the flickering of the phone still bothers me. And my suspicion here is that this is just a neurologic patterning from our history as humans. Flickering light is very dysregulating for our sympathetic, that is our fight or flight nervous system. If you're out in nature and you see flickering light, it's a fire. But it's not actually flickering. It's just sort of natural oscillation. But if you're on the highway and there's a blinking light, these are police lights, we're drawn to that. We cannot look away from things that are flickering or oscillating on and off. It draws our attention very quickly. And even though you're not aware that your phone is flickering, your nervous system is through your eyes. And so I think that's particularly dysregulating for a lot of people, especially me. And I've noticed that if I'm on my phone at night, right before I go to sleep, even with the blue light filter on, even with the phone completely orange, I will have trouble falling asleep. And that will completely negatively impact the whole night and the next day. So that's something I'm very, very careful of. I really have a love-hate relationship with my phone. The computer flickers at a different rate. So the Retina display on a MacBook is much faster. And that seems to be better, perhaps because our body perceives as flickering less because it's such a fast flicker rate. But I am not so down the rabbit hole that I could tell you one flicker rate versus another, but I will tell you that the lights in your house flicker, especially blue lights, especially fluorescent lights, especially lights in the ceiling of your house. That's all flickering at night. And so I don't want any flickering lights. So the red lights that I have are zero flicker LEDs from a company that does that. So I have intentionally created a zero flicker red light environment in my house at night, and it's just more calming. I try to go to sleep at the same time every night so I can wake up to surf, because I find that if I vary my sleep time, that also negatively affects my circadian rhythm. And we know that if you vary your sleep onset time, that can negatively affect your metabolic health. So it's important to me, right? Because I want to show up well in the world the next day. I want to feel good when I'm surfing. I want to feel good for training, martial arts, podcasting with my team, business decisions. I very singularly hate how bad I feel when I haven't slept well. There's not a lot of inputs that negatively affect my life as much as that.
No, I totally agree. So with the lights at night, you have your non-flicker red bulbs. I mentioned that strip that you put over your fridge, over the light in the fridge.
Yeah, I should talk about that. Yeah, I totally. It's just red cellophane, like some thick plastic, like a thick piece of paper plastic that I got on Amazon. And I hate this when I travel because none of the fridges have this. And people say, why are you in your fridge at night? And I say, well, the sun goes down here at 6:00. Everyone in the winter can understand this now who's in the Northern Hemisphere. We're all opening our fridges at night, and it's a small input, but it's a bright blue bulb right in my face, and it just feels offensive. So yeah, I covered it up as part of the whole protocol.
No, you've inspired me to get one of those.
You're going to love it.
You mentioned the hack on the phone. I do that as well, where you can set it to triple click.
Yes.
And then the phone turns on an iPhone. It can turn totally red.
Color filters.
We'll put the details in the show notes for that. The other piece that you mentioned is your screen. Is there any software you use on your laptop to help with the light and the flicker?
Iris, no affiliation, but I use Iris.
I use that too. And I was curious because they do have a setting on there to help with flicker. I don't know if it totally nullifies it or it just helps, but
interesting.
That is a piece of that software.
I didn't even know Iris had a setting for flicker. I'll have to look at that. I find, at least subjectively, that I'm less sensitive to my computer at night than I am to my phone. There's something about the phone, and I've tested this. So I have some friends in the space who have the meters. I don't have a flicker meter, but they brought, these meters, and they could test the phone flicker rate versus the computer flicker rate, and they're different. Something about the phone flicker rate is particularly dysregulating for me, and I think for a lot of people. But the phones, and I think this is intentional actually, they're addictive. And I think one of the reasons that it's hard to look away from your phone is because it's flickering. So this is very, very intentional, I think, in the design of these manufacturers. Like, they want us looking at your phone. That's the whole point. You're supposed to get some sort of dopamine, some sort of a good feeling, or some sort of something that draws your eyes into the phone that you can't look away. And I think the flicker is very intentionally designed, because there is now a company, I'm friends with these guys, but have no formal affiliation, named Daylight. And they make sort of an iPad, but iPad is Apple. So they make a tablet that has zero flicker. And it's a special type of LED. I think they did, I don't remember the tech. They did sort of a direct current LED diode maybe. And there's zero flicker in their screen, and it's much nicer to look at, much less addictive, much easier to look away.
I'll have to look into that.
Yeah.
Coming back to the Iris piece, the way I understand that software, if you have your brightness turned to max on your computer and then adjust the brightness through that app, that will nullify the flicker. So I'm going to have to do a deeper dive into it.
I think Iris is a good software in general. At night, they have a setting on your computer which just says sleep, and it really turns the color temperature down on your computer. And I'll have to look into the flicker, because I would like there not to be flicker in my computer. But again, I think because of the actual LEDs or whatever the technology is in the screen, I don't know if they can do that.
Okay. Well, we'll both do a bit of a deep dive into that. Yeah. You quickly mentioned the EMF piece. What are the things around your home you're doing to nullify that?
Yeah, so I don't use AirPods, right? I use wired headphones if I'm listening to music. So there's a couple of things when it comes to EMF, and this starts to get a little tinfoil hatty for people. So I'll try to keep it as scientific as I can. And I'll just say that when I'm in the States, it's very difficult to control all these factors. But when I'm in my own home, I can control them. And I do almost as an experiment. I like the way it feels when I'm camping. And one of the things that happens when you're camping is you don't have as much radio frequency EMF. So there are different frequencies to electromagnetic fields. The frequency of EMF coming out of your outlet is different. That's called ELF, so extra low frequency. That's also what happens when you have a power line near your house. That's ELF. And you can measure that in a different way. And there's also a magnetic field coming off a power line. What we'll talk about here is RF, so radio frequency EMF. That's a certain band of EMF that comes from cell phones, computers, Bluetooth, microwaves. And interestingly, what's coming out of your microwave is essentially exactly what's coming out of your cell phone or your Wi-Fi router. They're so close, it's not even funny. And I've done the experiment. I have a Wi-Fi meter that I've experimented with. You can put a Wi-Fi meter for the RF band in front of a microwave and turn the microwave on, and the thing goes nuts. I mean, there's a ton of RF EMF coming off your microwave. So if you're still using microwave and you're standing by it, you're getting a lot of radio frequency. Your Wi-Fi router produces this. Your computer produces this. When you have Bluetooth and Wi-Fi on your computer, your cell phone produces this. The biggest exposure that we have to RF is our cell phone, hands down. Your Wi-Fi router is contributing, but your Wi-Fi router isn't in your pocket all day. And I think AirPods are potentially very damaging for the same reason, that you're basically strapping a cell phone to your head for hours a day with AirPods. Just so you understand that. You're basically strapping a Wi-Fi router to your head. So there's no point in turning your Wi-Fi router off at night if you're using AirPods. It's just not even, there's no point. If you're still using AirPods, that's a big contributor to radio frequency EMF going straight into your brain. The thing people always push back on here is that radio frequency EMF is not ionizing, and that's true. If you go into an X-ray machine because you broke your arm or you have shortness of breath, that's ionizing. A CT scan is ionizing radiation. And ionizing radiation is much more powerful, and it's been shown to break DNA. Radio frequency EMF probably doesn't break DNA, but that doesn't mean that it's not biologically active. So that is where I think the conversation falls off, but it should continue because there's many studies, and we need better research in this field, but I don't know that the cell phone industry or telecommunications really wants this research to be done. There's a lot of research suggesting that radio frequency EMF can affect biological systems beyond damaging DNA, whether that's certain channels, calcium channels, voltage gated, channels. The potential for radio frequency EMF to affect biological systems remains real. It's not ionizing. It's not breaking your DNA. It's probably not causing cancer. That's what we worry about with ionizing radiation. But could it affect neurotransmission? Could it affect hormones? There definitely are studies in humans associating the positioning of a cell phone near your testicles with lower sperm counts and overall testosterone, which is concerning. So that's, again, it's affecting a biological system, not in an ionizing manner. And we just don't know. So I would rather avoid that as much as possible. You can either walk around in a literal tinfoil suit. They make EMF blocking underwear now and shirts and beanies and suits, or you can just mitigate it around your house with the first most important input being your cell phone. Understand if I don't know if you've ever done this. Do you have an RF meter at your house?
No, I don't.
If you take one of these, and I'll show you what it looks like.
Yeah, I'd like to play around with one, but I haven't.
Yeah, so it's just, it's this, type of thing. It's a handheld device. I could grab my cell phone if we want to do this, but I could just tell you how it looks also. So it's just this little device, right? And you turn it on and it'll tell you what the reading is here. And I don't know where, I'm getting a little bit of a reading because I'm using computers, and this computer I'm using might have Wi-Fi on it. And it's saying it's 700 to 1,000 microwatts per meter squared, probably coming off this computer I'm looking at here because it has Wi-Fi on the computer. That's only on when I'm podcasting. The rest of the time in my house, it's about 0.5 microwatts per meter squared. When I put this up to my cell phone, it goes 300,000 to 1 million microwatts per meter squared. So your cell phone is usually probably 20 to 30 to 50,000. So I would say 30 to 50 times when I'm looking at baseline here is your cell phone. The same with your AirPods, up to 300,000 or even 1 million microwatts per meter squared. So you're looking at 30 to 1,000 times higher levels of radio frequency EMF when you are using a cell phone or have AirPods in your ears, or when you put your cell phone next to your bed and all this kind of stuff. So it's a big deal. And we don't fully understand how that affects human biological systems.
And to me, when we don't fully understand something, it doesn't mean we don't know the negative effects yet. But to me, and it sounds like to you, that's enough reason to take caution until we do learn. Like, we have to assume the worst until we learn. And that doesn't make us tinfoil hat people. It's just like, we care about our health. And until we can feel confident doing something, we're going to err on the side of caution. So
yes,
I'm sure we see it the same way there.
Yeah, we see it the same way. Actually, let me do one thing. I'm going to turn off. So one of the guys on my team had to use the Wi-Fi router to talk to someone to set up the tech here. I'm going to turn the Wi-Fi off because usually there's no Wi-Fi at my house. My house is completely hardwired with Ethernet. I'm going to turn the Wi-Fi off. Okay, we'll check again. So there's still a little bit higher now. So one of the guys on my team turned the Wi-Fi router on. I have multiple different setups at my house, but it's much lower now that I turned the Wi-Fi off. Most of what's happening in my house is all hardwired with Ethernet. My suspicion is that this tablet that I'm using to look at right now has Wi-Fi and Bluetooth on in the tablet. So I could probably change that for the next podcast, but the numbers I'm seeing are much lower. But like I said, in general, at night when I'm not podcasting, my house is about 0.5 microwatts per meter squared. And if people want to test, you can get a meter. The only thing I'll say is that the meter is going to make you very unhappy because you're going to see much, much higher levels of RF in your house and around your community than you're hopefully want to be exposed to. And again, we don't know what the biological threshold here is. And so I'm trying to err on the side of caution. And like I said, everything in my house is wired. So I have Ethernet to my computer and Ethernet to my cell phone because I'm just trying to say, look, I have agency over this. Why not live in a very, very low radio frequency EMF setting?
What's the brand of that meter? Because I feel like for me, one of the areas of friction why I haven't gotten one and tested is because there are so many different ones. And I'm just curious, I can't read that. What does it say?
Safe Living Technologies. I have no affiliation with them. The other option is a tri-field meter. And this looks like it's made by Alpha Lab Incorporated. A tri-field meter does all of it. So the benefit of a tri-field meter is that the tri-field meter will also measure magnetic fields as well as RF. So yeah, most people shouldn't be exposed to much in the realm of the magnetic stuff. But yeah, the tri-field is another meter, which will do radio frequency, different units here. So the units on the tri-field meter are milliwatts per meter squared. So it's 1,000 times less than microwatts, right? So this is milliwatts per meter squared. And the Safe Living one is showing me microwatts per meter squared. So it's much more sensitive. There might be a way on the tri-field meter to get microwatts per meter squared. But yeah, either of the meters works good.
To recap, you don't use the wireless headphones.
Yeah.
Wired in with your internet and cell phone. You're not using a microwave.
No, not in my house.
Anything else throughout the house that you've done? And then to layer on to that, you mentioned these defense clothing pieces we can get. Do you buy into that and use any of that as well?
When I'm traveling in the States, I will wear like EMF blocking underwear. Who knows if it does anything, but yeah, I mean, I got tinfoil underwear, guys, not a tinfoil hat. I mean, I'm trying to protect my nuts. When I'm carrying my phone on my person, it's always on airplane mode. I'm not going to put my cell phone in my pocket on regular mode. You know, we could do it if you want to test it. I could show you my cell phone and turn the cell signal and the Wi-Fi and the Bluetooth on, and you'll see it go to 300,000 or 600,000 microwatts per meter squared. And again, we don't fully understand what the threshold is for actual biological effect and what's negatively affecting us as humans. I think it's just the better side of caution, like the better part of valor to minimize this. Not sleep next to your Wi-Fi router. I mean, who needs a Wi-Fi router at night? Turn it off. Don't sleep next to your cell phone. Turn it on airplane mode as much as possible. You know, do you want to be giving your 2-year-old a cell phone with tons of RF for them to like hold on to all day? Your iPad that you're giving your kids has a ton of RF coming off it. We don't know. We just don't know how these things affect us as humans. It's pretty interesting.
And then again, to extrapolate what I said before, because we don't know is reason enough to take caution. And you could extrapolate this to many things that I'm sure you and I do, whether it be, showering with a shower filter or filtering our air at home. There is so many different pieces, and there is science to back some of it up, but also we're just piecing it all together and erring on the side of caution until we continue to learn. And then we can solidify what we're doing or throw it away if it doesn't work.
That's just being cautious and informed as a human and not wanting to put your head in the sand. I agree with you. You mentioned shower filters. I don't have to worry about that in Costa Rica. The water at my house comes from a mountain stream. It sounds idyllic. It kind of is. But so there's no chlorine. There's no fluoride in my water here. When I drink water, which is rarely, I usually do fruit juice or milk. I will use a reverse osmosis filter and remineralize. So that's the water piece. But yeah, I think a shower filter is hugely valuable for humans. If you're living in a place that puts chlorine in the water or fluoride, I just built a pool in my house, which I'm really excited about. And I was able, even in Costa Rica, to put an ozone filter on the pool. Or an ozone generator. So there's no chlorine in my pool either, which is kind of cool because I won't even go in pools that have chlorine. I just hate the way it smells. I was recently this is in California, and I went to a wave pool for surfing, and they chlorinate the water. So I'm surfing in a wave pool, which is cool. I get these sort of perfect waves, but the pool has chlorine in it.
And we talked about last time, you're a minimalist in a lot of different areas, including oral hygiene. You weren't using toothpaste last time. And I saw in a recent video you posted, in the shower, you're using baking soda and vinegar instead of soap.
I don't even use soap in the shower, man. I mean, you can. I think that if you wanted to use a soap, there's stuff like Bronner's, which seems pretty clean. We can talk about the toothpaste piece first. Definitely, I don't think using a toothpaste with fluoride is a good idea. Fluoride is probably not something your teeth need. If you eat fat-soluble vitamins from meat and organs and eggs and cheese and milk, your teeth will be super healthy and you won't get cavities. There are immune cells in your teeth called odontoblasts, and they need fat-soluble vitamins, particularly vitamin K2, vitamin A, so you have to eat meat and liver. And those cells determine cavities. And so you can eat fruit and honey and not get cavities as long as you're getting enough fat-soluble vitamins. Toothpaste is not really the best way to prevent cavities, and certainly fluoride is not the best way to prevent cavities. There's lots of research now pointing to associations between fluoride and water and lower IQs in kids. It's a big deal and not something to be ignored. Again, more research is needed, but caution would suggest you don't drink water with fluoride and that you don't shower with water containing fluoride. These are probably not good for you. And I think most toothpaste that doesn't have fluoride is just kind of it's just a vanity thing. My breath doesn't smell bad. When I kiss people, they tell me it's just fine. I don't think I've ever had a girl tell me that my breath smelled bad. I always ask them, like, do I smell bad? Or please tell me. Bad breath is not the result of not using toothpaste. It's the result of dysbiosis in your gut related to poor diet. So halitosis is the technical term for it. We've all been around someone with halitosis and it's intense. You can sit feet away from someone and smell their bad breath. And on the flip side, humans appear to release pheromones from our mouth, our armpits, our groin. And those pheromones are important for pair bonding and attracting a mate or being attracted to your partner. So I've actually had women that I've dated tell me they like the smell of my breath. It's like kind of a turn on or something. And that's interesting, right? So why would I want to blunt that with a toothpaste? I don't need my breath to smell like mint. I just want my breath to smell like a human breath. And this is just me personally, but if a woman doesn't want that, then she's probably not the right woman for me. So I think toothpaste is kind of silly. You don't need toothpaste to remove the plaque from your teeth. You just need a brush. And I mean, this is going pretty far down the rabbit hole. People will just roll their eyes, but I think this is great. I love this. I brush my teeth with a bamboo toothbrush with boar's hair bristles because why would I put more plastic in my mouth and ingest more microplastics? Doesn't make sense to me. So you can get boar's hair toothbrushes on Amazon. We should probably sell that on, I should probably make that and just sell Lineage branded boar's hair toothbrushes. Maybe we'll do that soon because I love this. It's a great thing. It feels like a real toothbrush, but there's no microplastics in the bristles. And I don't have a plastic toothbrush in my mouth. And I'm just brushing with water, honestly. And my water at my house doesn't have fluoride. And it's fine. I mean, my teeth are, reasonable. I don't bleach my teeth. I don't do anything to my teeth other than brush my teeth. I also use floss. I do think about the compounds in the floss because a lot of floss, especially Glide floss, contains forever chemicals, PFAs. They've shown this in women using floss that when they use Glide floss, their levels of PFAs, forever chemicals, go up. So you can imagine that just pressing a piece of string coated with forever chemicals in your mouth repeatedly is a great way to expose yourself to perfluoroalkyl compounds. You don't want that in your floss. So I'll use a PFA-free floss or a silk floss that has obviously no plastic or plastic derivatives. So I think about what's going in my mouth. Mouthwash has been shown, I think, in multiple studies now to actually completely nuke the flora in your mouth. And you need microbiota in your mouth to make nitric oxide. And I believe that it actually attenuates gym performance. So they've done studies on either men and women, and they use mouthwash before they go to the gym. And I think they can lift less because of the nitric oxide detrimental effects associated with a mouthwash. So mouthwash, again, I used to use it like crazy. I remember going on dates and my family would say, I can smell the mouthwash across the room. And I said, great. I love the smell of mouthwash. It feels good. And I think, I'm just cleaning my mouth. It's so easy. I can just gargle something and spit it out, but it's horrible for your oral microbiome and actually has negative effects in humans. We need that oral microbiome to, also probably improve blood pressure. And I think that the mouthwashes could potentially, and they might have even actually been studied for this effect, negatively affect arterial vasodilatation and negatively affect blood pressure. So mouthwash, bullshit. Most toothpaste, bullshit. Look, if you want to use a fluoride-free toothpaste, that's super simple. Fine, knock yourself out. You don't need it. Don't use a toothbrush with plastic bristles. Don't use a plastic toothbrush. That's all kind of silly to me. I don't shower with soap. If you want to use soap, fine, but I don't like parabens. I don't like phthalates. I don't want fragrances. I don't wear cologne. And I've had multiple people smell me on podcasts now. It's like a thing. And I always get a little nervous, but nobody's ever said that it smells bad. I mean, Jake Paul smelled me when I was on his podcast. I recently did a podcast with Cody Sanchez in Austin, and she just came right over and smelled me. So I don't use deodorant. If you want to use a natural deodorant, you could use something like, apple cider vinegar, or vinegar could work. Rubbing alcohol works. It's not as abrasive as it sounds. There are natural deodorants out there, but again, even a lot of natural deodorants could have parabens, they could have phthalates. And I'm just trying to limit the amount of endocrine disrupting chemicals that are going onto my skin. It's an absorptive organ. I mean, there's a study that I came across recently. We can talk about clothing for a minute. Women who exercise in sports bras and leggings that contain BPA, BPS, or other endocrine disrupting chemicals that contain forever chemicals, there are measurably increased significant levels of absorption in sweat, when they're sweating. So like if you're wearing a sports bra or leggings to go to coffee with your friend, probably not a big deal. If you're exercising and sweating in these things, there's notable significant absorption of the chemicals from these garments into our blood. Okay, that's not great. I mean, think about how many people go to the gym and wear polyester shorts when they're exercising. You are absolutely affecting your balls negatively, men and women who don't have balls, the ovaries. It's getting absorbed through your vagina, through the vaginal mucosa. It's all happening when we're exercising in polyester containing clothing. So there's a massive argument. Don't sweat in things that are polyester or derivatives. They almost certainly contain forever chemicals. I've talked about this with Lululemon leggings, which have been tested for the fluorine derivatives, which are an indication of PFAs, perfluoroalkyl compound substances. That's the fluorine moiety in these compounds, which are the forever chemicals, known endocrine disruptors. Don't exercise in those. It's a bad idea. I wouldn't wear them ever, but look, if you're not sweating in them, okay, fine. You want to go to a nice dinner with your wife or your husband, you want to put on something polyester, fine. The biggest input, the biggest increase in absorption is through the sweat, or while we're sweating.
Hearing you talk about diet, your lifestyle, walking us through different areas of your life, and the level of simplicity you've gotten to sounds so appealing and freeing. For me, I'm very cognizant of everything you're talking about and make great choices, but it's still more complex. I love the level you've taken this to, where I'm guessing you can clarify it over time, slowly simplified and cleared out the things you don't need.
Yeah. I mean, I like simplicity. I like minimalism. And when there are things that I like, I really appreciate those. It helps me appreciate the things that are very valuable in my life. I don't need a complicated life. I don't even have a TV in my house, man. I don't, it's not that I don't watch things occasionally on my computer, but I don't have a TV. I don't have a microwave. It's a simple thing. And I think that's great. I think about the clothing. I think that it's just what we were talking about earlier. I think there's a lot of power in intention. And when I'm intentionally thinking about various aspects of my life over time, it doesn't happen overnight. I strongly believe that will positively impact my future health, the health of my family, future children, right? These are all things that I want to have already figured out before any of that happens, because that's important. And it's hard to make these changes in our lives. And so, yeah, I think about the air in my house and the quality of my water and what I'm putting on my body in every way, shape, and form. And because that's valuable to me. That's a really big ROI. So the return on investment there is massive. And yeah, it costs me a little bit. It's inconvenient in some ways, but I think we get so much when we do things that are difficult and we do things that are inconvenient. There's such a good upside to that. It's unquestionable.
All right, let's come back to the food and dairy specifically. We've touched on this a few times throughout our chat. You're a fan of raw dairy.
Yeah.
You mentioned starting the day with goat milk, but let's really get into the details here. We have the A1 versus A2, pasteurization, which you've touched on, but let's go deeper into that. Homogenization, different animals. We got the sheep milk, goat milk, cow milk. For somebody that's just been very conventional when it comes to dairy and having, say, a homogenized, pasteurized A1 cow dairy. Let's walk through the different steps here and how they can upgrade.
Yeah, so A1 versus A2 refers to a variant of casein, which is a milk protein. And there's a good amount of research pointing to the fact that A1 casein is probably more immunologically problematic for humans than A2. If you're talking about cows, Jersey cows and Guernsey cows are all A2, but most other cows are going to be some mixture of A1 and A2. So when I'm drinking cow's milk, I want an A2 cow's milk because there's two genes, right? So A2 means both genes. The cow is homozygous for the A2 gene coding for the casein variant. All goat milk, all sheep milk, all bison milk is all A2. Anything but cow's milk is all A2. So you can shortcut it by drinking a milk that's not cow, or you can find Jersey or Guernsey, or now there are more milks that say A2. And I think humans will tolerate A2 milk better than A1. What I drank growing up was probably A1 skim, pasteurized, homogenized milk. Dairy fat is super healthy for humans. It's so incredibly healthy for humans. There's a compound in dairy fat called C15 and C17. These are odd chain fatty acids. And recently I read a study showing that levels of C15, which is called pentadecanoic acid, correlate with protection from lipid peroxide-induced programmed cell death, which is called ferroptosis. So people may have heard the term apoptosis, but ferroptosis is what happens when you have too much oxidative stress in your body related to too many polyunsaturated fatty acids, harkening back to our previous conversation. One of the challenges with polyunsaturated fatty acids is their oxidative liability, and it can lead to programmed cell death, which is called ferroptosis. Not good. That's not a good thing. C15 protects against that, pentadecanoic acid. So a fat found in full-fat dairy, something that is widely criticized and said to cause heart disease, actually protects against lipid peroxide-induced cell death in humans. Levels of C15 in the human body directly correlate strongly to dairy consumption of full-fat dairy. So if you're thinking skim versus 2% versus whole milk, you want whole milk. You want A2 milk. And then I would argue you want raw milk. Now, every raw food has a risk of contamination. I'm sure you guys all know someone who's gotten sick from sushi or oysters. Most people every year, the majority of people, or I should say the largest amount of people who get foodborne illness every year get it from, do you know?
I know it's a type of green, maybe spinach.
Yeah, it's spinach. It's like spinach and other greens. It's not any animal food. So raw plant foods are what cause the most food poisoning in humans every year. But we don't hear that, right? Nobody's saying, oh, you got to pasteurize your spinach. How can we sell raw spinach? That should be illegal. Raw spinach should be illegal, man. But the FDA or the DEA, who controls raw milk, the Drug Enforcement Administration, right? So like Drug and Alcohol Administration, that they are the people that control raw milk. Drugs and alcohol, that's crazy. They raid raw milk producers. The DEA, they should be raiding spinach, right? Big spinach is in trouble. Spinach needs to be pasteurized. It's causing people to get sick. People die every year from raw spinach, man. Every year. But we never hear about that. Oh, you have to make sure you pasteurize your spinach. My point is just that all raw food has a chance of contamination. Sushi, oysters, meat, carpaccio, whatever. All of it has a risk of contamination. The quality with which your farmer makes his or her raw milk is everything. And so you want to get it from a farmer that you trust, that is raising cows in a clean way, that is cleaning the udders, and is doing it in a sanitary way. Pasteurized milk also can become contaminated with E. coli and Salmonella and Campylobacter. One of the largest outbreaks ever in our history in America was 1986. I believe thousands and thousands of people were poisoned from Salmonella in pasteurized milk. We never hear about that. People died from pasteurized milk in 1986 because when you pasteurize milk, you kill everything in that milk. A raw milk, I would argue, is in a lot of ways safer than pasteurized milk because you have all of the naturally occurring flora in the raw milk to outcompete any Listeria, any E. coli, any Campylobacter, any Salmonella. Now, every once in a while, raw milk does get contaminated and people get sick. Yes, It has to do with the quality of the production and how clean it is. But people get sick from sushi and spinach and everything. We talked about this, right? If you're getting it from someone that's doing it well, chances are it's pretty darn safe. If you want to be absolutely sure you're never going to get sick from foodborne illness, then you have to cook everything well done. You have to cook. You can't eat salad. You can never go to sushi, right? Don't ever eat anything undercooked. It just depends how you want to live. And so why would we eat raw milk in the first place, or drink in this case? There's a lot of interesting data that never gets brought up when people are vilifying raw milk around the unique immunologic effects of raw milk. I mean, there's been studies, the Gabriella study, many other studies in children growing up on or off farms that show that if they drink raw milk, they have lower rates of asthma, eczema, and allergy. Those are all the things that I suffered from as a kid. I wish I had raw milk when I was a child, but instead I got pasteurized A1 skim milk. Thanks, mom and dad. And I had eczema, asthma, and allergies. And ultimately, the severity of my eczema was what drove me to do a carnivore diet. That was the beginning of my story. But I think that there are unique benefits to raw milk in humans. And again, it's an individual decision that every parent must make for themselves, for their children. There's always a risk of contamination. You just have to make sure that you find it from a good producer that you trust. My parents told me the other night that they saw me on NBC News, and I said, oh no, I knew it wasn't going to be good. And they said, yeah, you were talking about raw milk. And I'm sure they were just shitting on me and saying, oh, he's spreading misinformation. And I'm positive, I didn't see the clip because I don't really care, but I'm positive that they did not give my whole spiel, right? I'm positive they didn't have me on NBC News saying, all raw milk is dangerous. You must make the calculus in your own mind. And people get sick from spinach and fish and everything else. No, they're just going to show me saying raw milk is good for humans, drink raw milk. There's been I think you should drink raw milk or raw cheese or raw butter if you're doing dairy. And a lot of people, at least anecdotally, find benefits to it. I certainly feel better with raw milk in my diet. I'm still a little bit sensitive to lactose. I can't do too much. And I don't think raw milk fixes lactose intolerance. But a lot of people do tolerate raw milk better than they tolerate pasteurized milk. A lot of people have issues with pasteurized milk and they can drink raw milk. Getting enough calcium in your diet to balance phosphorus, it's a very positive thing for human health, along with odd chain fatty acids and many, many other nutrients that occur in dairy. It's a health food. If you look at the studies in humans, dairy fat consistently and strongly associates with health outcomes that are positive in humans. So I would argue there's good evidence that dairy is healthy for humans. Even though we're not cows, and even though milk is for babies, it seems to be quite healthy for us as humans, and I would miss it if it weren't in my own diet. I don't think everyone needs to do it, but I think it's a beautiful, delicious thing that adds a lot of variety and unique nutrients to my diet. And if you're not thinking about a calcium phosphorus balance in your diet, you're leaving money on the table in terms of your overall health. You cannot just eat meat without balancing it with calcium. Calcium phosphorus balance is important, just like zinc and copper balance is important. And we can talk about that too. A lot of the minerals need to be balanced. There are other ways to get calcium without doing dairy, whether you're doing bone meal or other things, but generally, I think dairy is one of the easiest ways to get calcium. So yeah, that's generally my take on raw milk. Get it from a reputable source. The bird flu thing is, I would say, fear-mongering right now. I just don't think it's a big deal. And yeah, I mean, I think that they've found they being the mainstream legacy media, they've found a whipping boy in raw milk. And maybe bird flu is the next pandemic. I mean, I hope that that's not what will be used next to lock us in our homes and force us to take medical interventions that are not fully proven for fear of losing our jobs. But who knows? And I don't know why the bird flu fear is happening right now. But at this moment, I'm not aware of any humans that have become significantly sick from bird flu. And I think that the immunologists that I've seen studying it haven't actually shown that it can cross into humans yet. But we'll see. Cows generally don't get exposed to waterfowl. The original cases of bird flu in milk were related to grain feeding of cattle, and the grains that were being harvested in the field included some waterfowl because the harvesting combine went over a pond or something and just pulled up some birds, and they killed the birds, and they were exposed to the viruses from the birds got into the feed that was fed to the cows, the grains. And so again, a grass-fed cow, a cow that's raised on grass entirely for milking, should never really be exposed to bird flu in the first place. So again, it goes back to the quality of the food you're eating and what it's fed.
And this whole craze of pasteurization in North America, do you find when you travel, that's the standard as well? Like over in Europe and even in Costa Rica, Is the default in these other places of the world raw?
No, it's not, because, I mean, in Costa Rica, raw milk is illegal. In Europe, I think in some countries in Europe, raw milk is plentiful, but maybe in France. But when I was in Greece this past summer, so 2 summers ago, it was very, very hard to find raw milk. I had to go to a farm and get it directly from a farmer. So it's not prevalent in Europe from what I've seen. Some raw cheeses are. I mean, Parmigiano Reggiano is a traditional Italian cheese. Pecorino Romano is a raw cheese. There are a lot of, I would say, traditional regional cheeses that are raw, made with raw milk. But but yeah, raw dairy is not common in other countries, at least not Central America from what I've seen. And for good reason. It must be produced intentionally. It cannot be produced at scale easily. And people could get sick because you have to be very careful. The original history around raw milk is that most people drank raw milk up until the late 1800s. When people moved into cities, they wanted milk, and raw milk caused a lot of sickness in the early 1900s because it wasn't being produced properly. Cows were being milked in subsanitary conditions and fed spent grains of alcohol fermentation, which is called swill. That's where the term swill came from historically. And so people were getting sick. So pasteurization had a place and was very effective. And I think that over time, we've just never been able to go back to the raw milk, even though we have the resources in place now and we understand the potential sources of contamination much better. Our understanding of microbiology is much more advanced than it was 120 years ago. So it's possible. And I think it has unique benefits for humans. And not everyone can even tolerate raw milk. I was having dinner with a friend the other night, and he said his acne gets worse even when he has raw milk. So, okay, it doesn't work for everyone. I don't have any issues with acne with raw milk, and I really like it. And I know a lot of people that really benefit from raw milk in their life. And I've seen a lot of kids benefit from raw milk when their parents make that decision. So it's an interesting thing. And I think it's incorrectly vilified now without the whole story.
Talk to the homogenization piece, because this is less often talked about. And the way I understand it, it's a mechanical process that they put the milk through just so it doesn't separate.
Yeah.
So is that something that by default, when you're buying raw milk, it'll be unhomogenized?
Yeah.
And is that something that's important to you?
Oh, it's really important. I mean, if you've ever seen a raw milk with cream on top, it's delicious. I'll gently shake the milk unless you want to eat the cream off the top. But I was just in California at a grocery store and you can get cream on top milk. I think definitely you don't want to drink homogenized milk. Whether or not it actually is harmful to homogenize is questionable, but I think milk is just more delicious when the cream rises to the top and you get to shake it. Like there's no, I don't know, like the process of homogenization is not necessary for milk. Cream on top is much better.
Paul, before we come to a close here, a couple loose ends I want to tie. We've talked about beef. We got into chicken. We got into pork. The other big category of meat that people in the West are consuming is fish. And we quickly touched on this. But for people that are going to include that as part of their diet, let's talk about how you feel about that in a general sense and then quality.
Historically, I think fish has been a part of the human diet for thousands and thousands of years. More recently, fish is very, very polluted. Even wild fish is very, very polluted. I don't know that anyone is arguing for farm-raised fish. There are some operations that are doing sort of wild farming now, like Seatopia. No affiliation with them, but I've heard it's better. I haven't seen the actual data. But I think that farming of fish is generally horrible. Polychlorinated biphenyls, much higher. They're fed fish food, which is full of all sorts of pesticides and forever chemicals. So a farmed fish is a horrible thing to eat. Freshwater fish is pretty toxic these days. I don't think you want to fish in a lake and eat that fish anymore just because of the amount of industry and agriculture and environmental toxins that accumulate in lakes. And I mean, I used to fish when I was a kid. It was a really fun thing to do with my dad. We never ate the fish that I'm aware of, but freshwater fish, pretty freaking polluted. And there are studies suggesting that even one serving of freshwater fish now exceeds the limit of a lot of chemicals that both pregnant and non-pregnant women and men are supposed to get in a day or even a week. Atlantic salmon is entirely farmed. I would never eat Atlantic salmon. If you look at the label on Atlantic salmon, it has a coloring added. So just understand that Atlantic salmon is farmed fish and it would look just like your sea bass or your trout, it would look very, very white if it weren't coloring weren't added to the feed. Wild salmon is lower metals, but that's relatively speaking, and wild salmon is still pretty high in mercury and other metals. So even wild fish, I think, needs to be looked at carefully today. And a lot of people, I think, eat fish because red meat has been so vilified, and we're told fish is a great source of omega-3 fatty acids, which it is, but I think you can get plenty of EPA and DHA and ALA from animal fat, which we're told to fear, but is clearly healthy for humans, from dairy fat, butter, and egg yolks. I don't think humans need to eat fish to get enough omega-3s in any way, shape, or form. I'll comment on omega-3 in a moment a little further with regard to seed oils, but I just think that the levels of metals in fish beyond salmon are pretty substantial. Tuna is massively contaminated with lead. Well, mercury would be the biggest one, but lead, mercury, cadmium, and arsenic. Even the shellfish is pretty contaminated. So crustaceans, lobster, shrimp, scallops, which are delicious, mussels, oysters, pretty high levels of cadmium as bottom feeders. So making a lot of your diet into seafood of any form is a recipe for heavy metal toxicity. And people have talked about this. I mean, Tony Robbins got Hatterism, which is mercury toxicity related to Alice in Wonderland, Mad Hatter, right? The Mad Hatter had Hatterism, which is a colloquial term for mercury toxicity. Hat makers used to soak the fabric in mercury or something historically, and they would wear it on their heads, and they would get sort of psychosis related to heavy metal toxicity. So Tony Robbins got profound heavy metal toxicity from his pescatarian diet. A lot of people have. It's just a recipe for disaster today. And this isn't to say that meat or chicken are free of heavy metals, but they're much lower. And certainly if your meat is grass-fed and grass-finished, the levels of heavy metals are going to be massively lower than a freshwater fish or even a wild fish, and certainly lower than a farm-raised fish. So I think heavy metals come up more and more for me because a lot of food has them. We talked about oats. We talked about lettuce. I mentioned that chocolate is quite high in heavy metals. I recently did a piece of content about heavy metals in cinnamon. There's heavy metals in salt. I think we just need to know across all of our foods what the levels of lead, mercury, cadmium, and arsenic are. There's certain heavy metals that even occur in seed oils leaching out from the plastic containers, like antimony. But I think fish is dangerous today. It's just a scary thing to be eating. And I think most people are eating fish because they're afraid of red meat, and they need to know that red meat is back on the menu, and red meat is totally healthy for you and not bad for you in any way, shape, or form. Again, there's quality spectrum there. Eat grass-fed, grass-finished, preferably regeneratively raised, and look at the quality controls of the producer that you're getting it from. But I continue to strongly believe, and I'll say this again, that red meat is one of the healthiest foods on the planet for us today. It's healthier than chicken. It's healthier than pork. It's healthier than fish in so many ways. And it's eating grass. If it's eating grass for its whole life, it's a ruminant. It's just a very, very healthy food. And I hope that people wake up to that in terms of animal foods, red meat is, I would say, the healthiest animal food you can possibly eat. So eat more red meat. Don't fear it. It's not going to be a problem for you. And fish is just problematic. I think a pescatarian diet is a horrible idea today.
What you said about red meat there, I totally agree. Couldn't have said it better. It's a superfood. And again, coming back to what I said earlier, basing a lot of your diet around that, at least early on while you're learning, and the simplicity, if you can get grass-fed, grass-finished, even better. But either way, with that meat as your staple, you're going to be doing a lot of good.
And don't forget the organs, right? So meat is just the muscle meat. You know, we probably talked about that on our last podcast, but a little bit of liver every day goes a long way, or just a few ounces a week or half an ounce a day. I mean, that's usually what I do. You know, sometimes when I'm traveling, I'll do the hardened soil desiccated organs. When I have access to fresh liver, half an ounce a day, half an ounce. It's the size of a quarter, or, you know, like a small amount of liver a few times a week goes a long way in terms of our nutrition. I mean, liver is a multivitamin. If you want to go further, you can eat a little bit of heart. Heart is delicious. And I mean, I mentioned earlier, I do desiccated testicle, liver, heart, testicle, brain. The organs are valuable for humans. I mean, there's unique benefits to organs that have not really been talked about enough, but there's a good amount of historical research, mostly from Germany, and the team at Heart and Soil really did a great job finding all this research. But there's been studies in embryos and, injecting organ extracts into animals and humans that the organs really do seem to support the corresponding organ. And whether it has to do with bioavailable peptides that are stable in the organs when you freeze dry them, or that remain in the extract, or microRNAs at the level of the organ. I mean, you would have to eat, like hundreds of pounds of testicle to get a bioactive dose of testosterone. But there are now so many anecdotes of men improving their sexual function, their libido, their hormones by eating testicle or desiccated testicle that something is probably going on there. And though testicle does contain testosterone, we've tested this at Heart and Soil, it's probably not the testosterone. It's either peptides or microRNAs. I mean, women really benefit from eating uterus, ovaries, and fallopian tubes in a supplement or something because those are not really a delicacy. But the impact of organs on the corresponding organ is so profound. Liver is always regenerating, so liver seems to be uniquely beneficial for humans to eat. But there have been studies, randomized studies in humans looking at bovine cortex-derived phosphatidylserine improving cognitive outcomes in people with early onset dementia. And then they do phosphatidylserine derived from plants, and it doesn't have the same impact. So it's probably not the phosphatidylserine. It's probably something else in the bovine cortex being a part of the brain. So cow brain derived phosphatidylserine improves cognitive function in humans, but plant derived phosphatidylserine doesn't. So there's something going on with organs that we really don't fully understand. Just eat a little bit of organs every once in a while and humans do way better. And if you have problems with a specific organ, consider experimenting with eating the corresponding organ. That's historically consistent. And like I said, there's actual interesting science that has been done that we never hear about because it's kind of mothballed and in a library in Germany that we actually went and found, and other articles. I mean, there was an 1889 article in the Lancet, so that's not in Germany. A guy named Brown-Séquard. So there's a syndrome, when you learn neurology in medical school or residency, there's a syndrome of spinal cord injury called Brown-Séquard syndrome. And this guy, Brown-Séquard, taught at prestigious universities in Paris, Harvard, in the late 1800s, and he published an article in the Lancet about injecting testicle extract into his own body when he was 72 years old and finding invigorating effects. So it's not that the research hasn't been done, it's just historical. It's old research. It hasn't been repeated, but there is a precedent for this even in Western medical science. So eat some organs with your meat. You'll do a lot better. However you want to get them is fine. Fresh is probably best. Again, all raw food has a risk of contamination if you choose to eat raw liver. I do it all the time. I'm still alive. You make your own decisions. But yeah, red meat and organs, that's pretty good.
Paul, you mentioned that you want to close or at least come back to omega-3s and the seed oil. So we'll close on this. This is what I wanted to come to as well before we finished up.
So omega-6 versus omega-3, they seem to have different effects in the human body. And the amount of omega-3 in our diet is fairly small compared to the amount of omega-3 that we're getting, the amount of omega-3 in our diet is fairly small compared to the amount of omega-6 we're getting in our diet today, especially with our increased exposure to seed oils. But omega-3 and omega-6 go through parallel pathways of biotransformation in our cells. They have a shared series of enzymes that are desaturases and elongases. So these enzymes add double bonds, they desaturate, and they elongate these chains. So it starts with ALA, alpha-linolenic acid, on the omega-3 side, which is found in animal foods, but also in plant foods, and linoleic acid on the omega-6 side. And they go through a series of parallel enzymes. And I think one of the problems for humans today in terms of omega-3 deficiency is that we are eating too many omega-6s. And that's been talked about before. But the reason for that is that when you eat a lot of omega-6, linoleic acid being the primary one in our diets, all of the enzymes get used up converting the omega-6s. So it takes linoleic acid to gamma-linoleic acid and other intermediates, arachidonic acid. And those are generally used in inflammatory processes in the human body. The body has ways to control it, but if you eat more linoleic acid and you have D5D and D6D, which are turned on and are working a lot, which is delta-6 desaturase and delta-5 desaturase, that combination has been associated with a lot of negative outcomes in humans. And in fact, there have been Mendelian randomization studies looking at D6D, which is delta-6 desaturase, which is part of that omega-6 pathway. And Mendelian randomizations are imperfect, but as far as a Mendelian randomization goes, they can connect causality with D6D for cardiovascular disease, which essentially means that if your delta 6 desaturase is working more and you're eating a lot of linoleic acid, in terms of a Mendelian randomization study, that's pointing a strong finger at that directly causing cardiovascular disease. Now, D6D is only involved in omega-6, but it's one of these it's a shared enzyme for omega-3 and omega-6, but it has to do with the linoleic acid and the fact that these sort of inflammatory downstream intermediates are made by D6D. So you don't really want to be giving your body a lot of linoleic acid to make into things which are probably incorrectly inflammatory in your body through D6D. And when you eat a lot of linoleic acid, your body can't bioconvert the omega-3s, which I think leads to deficiencies in omega-3s. So I don't eat a lot of omega-3s. I don't eat a lot of EPA and DHA, but I get a good amount of ALA from animal fat. I get some EPA and DHA in milk and some in my, I would say my animal fat, my butter and my tallow and the fat that comes on my steaks, but I don't eat a lot of egg yolks anymore. I think I'm kind of sensitive to eggs immunologically, and it's hard for me to find good quality eggs, like we talked about earlier. But when you look at my omega-3 levels on a test, I have lots of omega-3s because I'm not gumming up the biosynthesis pathway for omega-3 with a bunch of omega-6s. I have very, very low amounts of omega-6 in my diet because I don't eat egg yolks. I don't eat chicken. I don't eat pork. I don't eat seed oils. Like the omega-6 in my diet is extremely low. It's not zero, and it doesn't need to be zero, but the amount of omega-6 linoleic acid in tallow or ruminant animal fat is 1% to 2%. It's very, very low. So you will make more omega-3 if you don't eat too much omega-6. So I think the problem for a lot of humans today is not only do we not eat enough omega-3 because we're eating too many ultra-processed foods, but we're eating far too much omega-6, and that's preventing the conversion of omega-3 into the downstream metabolites that it needs to become, the DPA, the DHA, and the EPA.
All right, Paul. That's a good way to wrap up. We'll leave it there. We're going to link up Lineage Provisions, Heart and Soil, the new documentary that's on the Heart and Soil YouTube channel, your website, your social media, everything in the show notes. Always a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, if people I'll put in the plug for that. If people want to learn more about seed oils, we did a 37-minute mini documentary with Heart and Soil. It's on the Heart and Soil YouTube channel. It's called Fed a Lie. And you can show it to your mom or your dad or your grandmother who's never even heard of seed oils. And it's kind of an entry point for people to start thinking about how we might have been misled with regard to these oils. But I think getting seed oils out of your diet is one of probably the most important things you could do for your long-term health.
You guys did a great job. Thank you. Now that you're done, you're going to want to stick around here and catch this other incredible episode. You don't want to miss it. I'll see you over there.
We are literally the only species on the planet that hires somebody else to tell us what to eat. And we are the sickest we've ever been despite that, or probably as a result of that. If you are carnivore, if you are keto, if you are vegan, if you are